Are you ready to talk about academic language? You know the problem with academic language? There's an academic language for academic language. And until we're familiar with the academic language of academic language, then we have difficulty with academic language. And so that's just one little idea of just how confusing this whole thing can be. But it's really not that bad. I think a lot of us we're just not accustomed to using some of the terminology. All this stuff we're already doing. It's just a matter of getting things named and identified and our supports in place. So today we're going to be talking about understanding these language demands and writing about academic language in your lesson plan. So when we think about academic language is actually on a continuum. Now, if you look here, we have all the way to the left is the conversational language, and then all the way this way is the academic language. So conversational language is very casual. You might be texting your family and not even bother to spell words out. You might use a letter U instead of writing Y-O-U. Writing an email with an old friend. All of these things are fairly casual. All the way up to the opposite of reading academic literature and writing academic literature is at the other end of the scale. And if you read, for instance, an academic journal, it uses jargon, complex sentence structures. It's not easy to read. So when we talk about academic language, we're talking about that formal language that is used when academics speak. There are 5 types of language skills that occur in a classroom. One is listening, one is speaking, we have reading and writing, and we have performing. Listening and speaking, we see how those are related. One is coming in and one is going out. Reading and writing, input, output. And so these skills here are receptive. Listening and reading are receptive, whereas speaking, writing, and performing are expressive. Now, of course, we want students to practice both receptive and expressive language skills in our lessons. However, the EdTPA primarily assesses the expressive and productive language skills, mainly because that's what they can assess. And so one of the things that you're looking for, we're going to be concentrating then on expressive language, and one of the things that you'll be looking for is thinking about what that product is. When you speak, there's something that comes out. Are you having a discussion? Are you actually doing a speech? Are you having a debate? A performance, that's a product. Even though it's not a thing, it's still something that you produce. And writing also. So our language is just everywhere. We're using vocabulary, discourse, rules, and structure. Rules and structure also applies to everything else. So rules and structure applies to vocabulary, and it applies to our discourse. So rules and structure is called syntax. And most of the time in a lesson, you're going to have all 3 of these language demands. You're going to have vocabulary, you're going to have discourse, and you're going to have syntax. However, you're going to probably also be concentrating on one more than the other. For example, when you're teaching the students about writing a paragraph, are you teaching the structure of the paragraph? I mean, is that the objective, that the students model a particular structure in their paragraph? Or are you having them write the paragraph as a way to express knowledge, and that particular model is just the vehicle? So even though syntax may be in a lesson, it may not be the focus of the lesson. All lessons, no matter what grade level, we might be in the young grades, we might be in the older grades, we can be in college, we can be anywhere, and there's going to be vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. With your lesson plan, we have you practice what you're expected to do in the Ed TPA. And that's to identify a key language task. So you're thinking about your lesson that you've written, and now you need to think about an activity from your lesson that uses expressive language heavily. Where are they writing, speaking, and performing? What if you had to name the most important part of your lesson as far as the use of academic language, using the fancy words and the structure and that sort of thing? That would be your key language task. Language demands, then, are going to be those things that we use to complete that task: the function, the vocabulary, the syntax, and discourse. Except that even though we recognize there's syntax often used in every lesson and discourse, we're not going to try to identify both of them. So let's start with language function. With everything that students are expected to do, they need to use their brain. So we have to always be thinking about the purpose of the activity. Is the purpose of the activity to respond, perform, justify, synthesize? Where can we find this elusive verb? We start by examining the standard or the learning objective. Just like everything else, let's start with the standard. Here's one. Students will describe early North American and Tennessee settlements and examine the founding of the 13 colonies, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so look at the standards. Look at these verbs: describe, explain, examine, identify. So these verbs, if you were to think of them as having a language task where the students were doing this, where they were describing, that's pretty much going to be done in language. Explaining, those types of things are going to be using language. This verb then can be or use, we could use this as our language function. So this is a great way to start. So after you choose your standard, how do you come up with a language objective? Well, let's use this one. Describe the failure of the lost colony of Roanoke and the theories associated with it. What is the language function that we can pull from the standard? Describe. Very good. What type of language task or product can you imagine that will engage your students in this language function? Turn and talk for younger kids or even older ones. Maybe writing an essay, presentation. There would be other ones. So this is your verb. This is your language task or your product. Now we write the language objective. We put it together. And we're not going to forget to bold and underline the language function, because that's what our directions say in the lesson plan template. The learner will describe failure of the lost colony in a turn and talk. That is your language objective. So, based on the purpose, the language task, the language objective, the product, is syntax or discourse more important in the task that you're describing? That's for you to decide because you are the designer of your lesson. So you're going to decide if what you're doing, if the syntax is the most important part or the discourse. And we decide that by looking at the purpose. So, for example, if you're deciding that the learning task focuses on discourse or syntax, let's start with the definition and the purpose of discourse. This definition: how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction using the structures of written and oral language. In other words, the purpose of discourse is to communicate content. And you might do that with writing or talking, discussing, reporting, presenting, but you're communicating content. Definition and purpose of syntax: the rules and structures for organizing words or symbols together into phrases, clauses, sentences, or visual representation. It's the purpose of the syntax for students to correctly use a structure or rule. So the essential question becomes, what's the purpose of the function, task, and product that we've just talked about? What's the purpose? Is it to communicate content, the product that you're having the students come up with? Or is it to correctly use a structure? Who decides what the purpose is? You do. Because you are the designer. But you can't say that it is and then write something goofy, right? So if it is to use the structures of written and oral language in order to communicate content, then the focus of the language task is discourse. If you're focusing instead on the structures or rules themselves more than you're focusing on the content, then the focus is the syntax. Again, you decide, but what you decide is important because you've got to reflect that in your writing. Now, when a kid learns to speak, they come up with singular words. The vocabulary comes first. And then, before you know it, they are putting words together in sentences. And that's structure. So we've got the individual words, which is the brick, and then we've got putting them together with mortar, and that's the structure. If your lesson is focused on the vocabulary and the structure, then your lesson or your learning task is syntax. For example, if you're focused on getting the students to get the words or write the sentence grammatically correctly, or put the things in the correct order, or to sort, or to organize, then this is syntax. But if your language is going a step further and putting it together to make something bigger, your final product, much bigger than just vocabulary and structure, then this is discourse. Let's take a look at some of these examples that we have here. Artist statements, lab reports, speeches, debates, essays, interpreting graphs, writing a review, describing the elements of playing a sport, constructing an argument in a two-column proof. In all of these, what is the purpose? The purpose is to communicate content. Mathematical sentences, Punnett squares, grammar and punctuation, If you're talking about sentences and you're recognizing or writing independent and dependent clauses, transition phrases, cues and PE, musical notation, chord progression, using longitude and latitude for location, writing a thesis statement correctly, learning how to do citations correctly. All of these, the purpose is focusing on rules and structure. So here, since it's communicating content, we know that these are all examples of discourse products, whereas these are all examples of syntax products. So which is it, discourse or syntax? Students have been studying the causes of the Civil War. They have completed research and will now use the 5-paragraph structure to write an essay. The teacher will be assessing the students' knowledge of the Civil War. Students have been reading a non-fiction piece on the causes of the Civil War. The teacher has been reviewing the structure of the thesis statement and now asks the students to apply their new skill in addressing this content. So here we can see that the teacher is assessing the students' knowledge on the causes of the Civil War. Because of that, you should have guessed that this is discourse because they're communicating content. Whereas here, the teacher is focusing on the thesis statement and how well students are able to write one within the context of the Civil War. Hopefully, you correctly guessed syntax. Language functions drive the language task. Um, it, the functions make the focus of the syntax or discourse more obvious. So, model, locate, apply, identify. These are all examples of syntax language functions, and these are syntax language objectives. Look at the discourse ones. Explain, interpret, create. Take a minute and see if you can figure out if you know what the similarities are in these. The similarities are in these. How are they different from each other? Model, locate, identify especially. All of these show a real precise to their nature, whereas preciseness. I don't know if that's a word. Or explain, interpret, create. These are much broader, more open-ended. So the discourse tends to be a verb that's much more open-ended. Let's do some practice. Well, here's the language objective. The learner will argue for or against prohibition in a debate. What is the language function in this objective? Did you say argue? Good. What is the language product in this objective? Did you say debate? Good. Is it discourse or syntax? The learner will argue for or against prohibition in a debate. Did you say discourse? I knew you would. That's right. It's discourse. Okay. That's using this again. Let's talk about the vocabulary. So we've got our language objective. The learner will argue for or against prohibition in a debate. Let's talk about the vocabulary. When we talk about vocabulary, it's really, at this point of the game, I don't find it particularly useful to identify tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words. I think that is something that is not going to benefit you at this point. But you do need to think about words that are going to help the students, words that they might need to know in order to complete the function. For example, argue. To complete the product, debate, and address the content. That's why you often see on our lesson plan template a separation between academic language and content vocabulary. Academic vocabulary are that's the uh, that's the vocabulary that you need for your function and for your product, your syntax, your discourse. So, for example, my students need to know how to argue in a debate, so they're probably going to need to know at some of these points the words claim, fallacy, generalization. I've got that written twice. I must have thought that was pretty important. Conclusion, affirm, all of these might be terms, depending on how old my students are, that I would need to make sure that they were familiar with and had some practice with. And these terms would be within the content of prohibition. The 18th Amendment, the temperance movement, bootlegging, repeal. So we've got content vocabulary and we've got academic language vocabulary. Okay, I recommend to students when I'm supervising them or helping them with their lesson plans, when you're planning your lesson, you need to be thinking about how many words really could a student get a good handle on in one lesson. For you to be able to present these words contextually and for them to have the opportunity to practice the words, I think you can't really go over 5. And I don't know how many of you all have walked into classrooms and the teacher says, okay, here's 20 words on the board, and you look them up and write the definitions and from the back of the book. And golly, would I be a genius if I could remember every definition I ever wrote to every word? But I can't remember a single one. And so there you go. That's not how we learn vocabulary. We don't learn vocabulary from definitions. Um, we learn vocabulary from context. That's how we learn to speak, and that's how it works just in general. For example, if when you are a child, you first start learning the words, and then you start putting them together, and you don't learn them because someone teaches you a definition. You learn what it means because of what you get back when you put it out there. And we start using new words because we read them and they become part of our vocabulary. That's why reading is so important. So we're not going to, even though we could, we're not ever, ever going to describe both discourse and syntax in our lessons. There's no need in it. You're not ready for it. The prompt in the EdTPA does say syntax and or discourse. And whenever there's an or, the or is more important than the and. Describe it, if you're looking at that rubric. And this is what your lesson plan template does too. Also with your lesson plan rubric, adding more, having both does not add any more points to you, but it does increase the chances that you will misidentify academic language. And often the activity that students believe is syntax, it's actually a support that's being used to help them with their discourse. So let's look at the rubric that we have for our lesson plan. So meeting expectations, academic language demands, and these are the demands: vocabulary, function, syntax, discourse. If somebody says, what are language demands? You're going to answer vocabulary, function, syntax, discourse. These demands are identified and are connected to the objectives, the rigorous state standards, and functional language demands. Then you have supports that are planned and described and directly support the learner's understanding and use of vocabulary, function, syntax, and discourse. Now, to go above meeting expectations, you would have all of this, plus there'd be an explanation about how one or more of these language supports are designed or differentiated to meet the needs of students with differing language needs. So as you can see, the biggest and most important part, besides being able to identify them correctly and connect them to the standards, is that you've got to have good supports. So let's take a look at the supports. There are 3 kinds of supports that we ask you to identify in your lesson plan. One is the general supports. Now, general supports, this just simply means that these are supports that students have available with them, a good deal of the time, maybe even all the time. But their word walls, their anchor charts, their glossaries are in the back of the book all the time. They've all got their notes. They're just things that students could use, and they're general. The difference between general and targeted is that they both support language demands. They support function, vocabulary, discourse, and syntax. But the targeted supports have been created specifically or found, maybe not created. The teacher has dug up something to use or borrowed something to use or created something to use. But anyway, the design of the support is targeted because it has a purpose of supporting students for function. For example, if your function was compare and contrast, you would give your students a Venn diagram, and that Venn diagram would be there for the sole purpose of helping them with the function. You might provide a specific word bank. If they're working on an essay, a support would be to give them an outline. Graphic organizers or other supports or sentence stems, models or representations. These are all targeted supports. They don't target people. They target what? They target function, vocabulary, discourse, or syntax. They're called targeted not because they target people. They're not called targeted in this situation because they target skills. They're called targeted because they target these language demands. Got that? That's very important. Individual supports are where you have students who you anticipate specific students or groups of students are going to have difficulties on certain parts. You maybe have students who aren't very good readers or maybe aren't very good at writing. In some way, they struggle with receptive language or expressive language, and so you can offer those students support. These do not have to be students, again, that have IEPs or 504s. Just from your observation and knowing your learners who might struggle with this product. So let's talk about how it goes into the lesson plan format. First of all, you're asked to do your language function. And the directions are for you to write a language objective and to underline your function. So here we can see that the function is produce. The student will produce an illustration and writing of the character's actions or feelings. So let's see if that's what they're doing here in the key learning task. Students will be describing a character's actions or feelings through an illustration and writing sentences. So I'm looking at this language function and I'm looking at this key learning task, and what do you think I'm thinking? I'm thinking about these verbs. One's produce, one's describe. So let's skip on down here to the discourse. The description of the discourse. The student will demonstrate discourse through interpreting a character's actions or feelings by creating an illustration and writing sentences. So what's going on with this student? is that they're struggling with the verbs. Produce, describe, demonstrate discourse. Don't ever do that. Interpret, create. And those are the problem is that we just need to get down to the brass tacks. You think maybe if we could look back at the standard, we could probably see what the verb is. And that's why using the standard is so helpful. Your verb, your function doesn't have to come from the standard. I'm just telling you, it's a good place to start. What if we just put describe here? The student will describe an illustration. The student will describe characters' actions or feelings in an illustration and in writing. What's wrong with that? I think that's got it. So, other than that, she does, though, a good job describing general supports, a good job with individual supports, and she's remembered to use this sentence stem that is so important in order to support students with their language function, blah, 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 in order to support vocabulary, in order to support discourse. Very good. Let's look at this next one. Okay, language function. The student will interpret manipulatives to find the quotient of division equations. I'm not sure what that means. So let's take a look down here at the discourse. The discourse for this lesson is the student will represent their knowledge of division in relation to multiplication. So our problem here is that she's not told me what the language task is. This is a math lesson. And the math people struggle because they want to just talk about the math. They forget we're talking about the language. So here she's focused on, look what she's focused on. Quotient, manipulatives, division, equation. But aren't these students talking? Could we have the students do a turn and talk to where they maybe are describing with each other? So you see how it gets all messed up because she's not described a language task. Describing that language task is really important. I mean, she's got the right idea down here, but this top part just doesn't work. All right, let's look at this one. Language function, the student will analyze. Now we've got the key learning task. One task for the lesson plan that provides students with the opportunity to practice language is in this task, the student will be analyzing the text through annotation, underlining places, blah, 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 by having students. So we got lots of words you analyze over and over again. That's good, good, good. Let's see what we're going here. Syntax or discourse. In order for students to engage in discourse, they will describe the information of the text. I don't like it when a different verb is used here than what's used here, because remember, the function is driving everything. So the language function is still analyze. It's just that they're expressing the analysis in another way. Let's go back. I'm sorry. So that's a problem. But good general supports expressed well. Learning partner, that would be general. Annotations with their whole group. These were available to everybody. And support the function to support the vocabulary in order to support the discourse. And she's thought about her struggling learners. So this is pretty good. I'm just maybe not happy about how she's described the discourse. But it's all right. Not really a problem. I wouldn't mark it wrong or anything like that. Okay. Just to go back for a second, what I would do, I think, is that I would say to express the analysis. after the analysis. Then I would talk about what they're going to do. Okay. The learner will defend their opinion. The function is defend. The product is debate. Okay. Discourse is a debate. The students will be have regarding their opinion. Good. General supports. Description of those. Targeted support. Use the sentence structure in order to support vocabulary, in order to support discourse. Good. She's added in essential literacy strategy. That's good. This is an EdTPA one. You don't have to worry about that yet. Hang on. You will. Okay. Individual supports. That's good. Very good. Very, very good. And see, they don't have to be long to be good. This one's not long, but it's still good. This one's not long. But let's look at it. The student will explain. Discourse. The discourse for this lesson is an oral explanation of the steps. Isn't that a beautiful work of art whenever you've got the explain and explanation all lined up? So nice. Again, the supports, targeted supports, individual supports. All right. Remember this from the last module? You're going to open it up and you're going to copy and paste the information that you wrote from the last module. You're going to put that into your new module. So what I'm saying is that we're going to have a different template this module, the template for academic language assignment, but you're going to use a lot of the same information. You don't need to recreate everything. And now you're going to take your template for the academic language assignment, copy and pasting from the last module, and they're just going to add in the academic language section. Here is what it looks like. It's got the italicized directions and reminders. Okay, so what do you think? You think you're ready? It's a hard, and this is our longest lesson that we've had. It's about 37 minutes, but I think you can get it. We've got the reading that should help you, and I think you'll be ready to go. That's the academic language of academic language. You have a great day.